Hello, everyone, and welcome again to the Contenders Project, where each week we are urging you, as Jude urged his readers, to contend for the faith that was once for all entrusted to God's holy people. Today, and over the next several weeks, we will be continuing in our current series that we are calling I'll Do It Tomorrow, talking about finding the power to change. The big idea in this series is that we will explore the difficulties of change and the Christian life. We will look at topics like procrastination, sanctification, and then the importance of cultivating spiritual habits in our life to help us navigate change. The ultimate idea is that change in a Christian's life is actually a life-giving process that we can either embrace, avoid, or run from. As we discussed this last week, change is the one constant in life. Seasons change, people change, governments change, animals change, and the list could go on and on. Some of those changes can be positive and exciting. A promotion at work, the first cool day of a fall after a long summer, your team winning the World Series or the Super Bowl. Other changes in life can be painful and negative. The loss of a marriage, unexpectedly being let go from your job, or having a child go through a traumatic accident. All of these experiences are changes in life and can bring about happiness, sadness, joy, or fear. And as we discussed last week as well, change is something that either brings us closer to God or takes us farther away from Him. And all of that is dependent on our perspective of change and what we decide to do when things change. Do we trust God in the season that we are in, or do we turn away from Him? Today's bottom line, as we discuss change, is that change is necessary. Change is prescribed, and change is actually very beneficial, because today's bottom line, the Christian life is about changing to reflect more of Jesus through the process of sanctification. The Christian life is about changing to reflect more of Jesus through the process of sanctification. You may have heard the phrase, no pain, no gain. Have you heard of this as you were maybe working out, exercising? The phrase stresses the idea that growth comes about painfully, through hard work and sacrifice. This is true for physical growth, but the same can be said about growing as a Christian. Most oftentimes, the change that hurts the most can also be the most rewarding, or the biggest cause of great growth. Take, for example, people who have gone through a tragic accident and have had to relearn how to walk. That can be not only physically painful, but also mentally strenuous. They are having to go through physical therapy and relearn something again that they thought they already knew. Take, for example, the challenges that come with completing school, losing weight, having a tough project to work on at your job. All of these things can be physically, mentally, emotionally painful or exhausting. But all of those things, if persevered through, show great growth through change. Do we like growth and change when it's painful? Most of us would probably say, no, we don't. There's a psychologist by the name of Jennifer Kunst who describes why we are sometimes cautious of change and growth when she says, the first way of approaching life is by avoiding pain and seeking pleasure. It is a very simple system. If it feels good, then eat it, take it, or do it. If it feels bad, then spit it out, get rid of it, or avoid it. However, she goes on to encourage a different way of living, one that can be described as developing a mental muscle. The mental muscle is one that can be strengthened, built up, and become adaptable to change and growth. To whereas our fortitude and ability to accept and wade through growth and change, regardless of how tough it is, begins to build up our mental muscle. But then the opposite is true as well. Our lack of commitment to growth or change in adverse circumstances, like how a muscle atrophies when underused, our mental muscle will begin to atrophy and not only prevent us from experiencing the growth and change that we desire, but weakening our ability to face circumstances head on. Paul admonishes believers in Romans chapter 12, verses 1 to 2, to present ourselves as a sacrifice, to be transformed again. In Romans 12, 1 to 2 says, "Therefore I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is your true and proper worship. Do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is, his good, pleasing, and perfect will." The image in these verses of sacrifice relates to the Old Testament practice of offering animal sacrifices as worship to God. Paul is saying that the life of a believer is a living sacrifice, one that is set apart for God and is in constant worship to God, and that this happens by the renewing of the believer. We are to, as the unblemished sheep of the Old Testament, we're set apart to God as a sacrifice, to set apart ourselves, our lives, to be dedicated to him. And in doing that, we are fulfilling our true and proper worship to God. And as Paul says, we do that by allowing God to transform us from the inside out through the renewing of our minds. And when we do that, we will begin day in and day out to be able to test and approve what God's will is. The process of Christian growth is called sanctification. Theologians have described sanctification as a separation to God, an imputation of Christ as our holiness, purification from moral evil, and confirmation to the image of Christ. Sanctification begins when we come to faith in Jesus, when we understand that God has set us apart as his children. However, God continues to transform us from the inside out so that each and every day we can reflect Christ to the world more and more. Christian change doesn't happen in an instant. There is no microwave spirituality, which means that growth, change, takes time. Given the choice between fast food or a home-cooked meal, most people would prefer the latter. Fast food is quick and will temporarily fill your stomach, but it's typically highly processed, unhealthy, and expensive. A home-cooked meal made in the oven or a slow cooker gives the food time to marinate and absorb all the flavor. And yes, it takes more time, more effort, and maybe even more frustration, but in the end, it's worth it. And it's usually better for you too. Sanctification, change towards conformity to who God is calling us to be. Sanctification is the lifelong growth of the believer, with all the complexities and messiness that entails. For contemporary Christianity, easy answers are the norm, but sanctification is not always easy. It relies on trust, on community, and an ongoing work of the Spirit. The Spirit renews and transforms believers from the inside out. The same Spirit who raised Christ from the dead lives inside of every believer. And sanctification is not a type of behavior management, but an actual transformation of a person at the core. Instead of changing only the behavior, God changes our thoughts, changes our emotions, changes our habits by the power of the Spirit. Us believers, we believers, put to death sin and unrighteousness. One way Christians can grow in Christ is to cultivate spiritual disciplines, prayer, service, study, meditation. And those are just a few practices Christians have and have used for centuries to cultivate spiritual growth. Many of those we discussed in our previous series, Contending for Your Relationship with God. Theologian Richard Foster describes the importance of these disciplines when he says, disciplines do not earn us favor with God or measure spiritual success. They are exercises which equip us to live fully and freely in the present reality of God. And God works with us, giving us grace as we learn and grow. The question then becomes, through change, through adversity, will you seek God and persevere for growth's sake? Or will you take the easy way out? Will you allow God to change and transform your life to more reflect Him and His Son? Will you make the decision today and commit today that you are going to allow God to change and transform your life to more reflect Him and His Son Jesus? To contend for your faith this week, begin by deciding whether or not you are willing to be transformed, renewed, and changed from the inside out. And to offer yourself every day as a living sacrifice to God, no matter how hard that is. Committing and making that decision is always the first step. Because when you commit your life to God, His Spirit, His love, His grace, His strength works through you. And then when you face difficulties, you will be able to persevere, to grow and change because you'll be doing it with God. Ask yourself the questions. Where do I need to experience growth? Where do I need to renew my mind? Where do I need to be transformed? What areas of my life need to better reflect Jesus? What do I need to set aside so that I can offer my life fully to God? And in reflecting on some of these questions, you may find the growth or the change that you are looking for, the growth that you need to contend for your faith and grow closer to God. So, as you now begin to discuss in your groups the questions and the prompts that have been provided for you, I encourage you to also discuss some of these questions as well, as to encourage one another, as we are all in this process of renewal and transformation together. So it's with that I again want to thank you all for joining us, and we'll see you next week for the next Contenders Project.